We have been covering the case of Leonard Taylor, and if you missed this week, Leonard Taylor in Missouri was executed. The state of Missouri executed him. And if you don't know the case, back in 2004, he was accused of killing his girlfriend and his girlfriend's three children. Leonard Taylor maintained that he was in California at the time of the murders. There are a lot of ins and outs of the case, but basically, it was said that the bodies were found, and the bodies had rigor mortis, which would mean that at the time of these murders, Leonard Taylor was not even in the state of Missouri. Nonetheless, he was convicted. There are also other angles to this. His brother said that he committed the crime, but his brother would later say that he was pressured by police. There was a lot going on in this case, and I just felt like, at the bare minimum, do not execute him. Nonetheless, they did, and the governor of Missouri, Mike Parson, insisted on executing Leonard Taylor, and he has now gone at 58 years old and wasn't even allowed to have a spiritual advisor. Let's bring his lawyer back on. His lawyer was on over a month ago talking about the Leonard Taylor case. Mr. Kent Gibson, how are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you.
Mr. Gibson, did the state of Missouri execute an innocent man?
I think so. I've been doing cases like this for over 30 years, and he is among the two death row inmates that I know about who've been executed in Missouri, who I really truly believe are innocent. There are probably a few others that there was enough doubt that they shouldn't have been executed, but in Leonard's case and one other one that I'm aware of, I'm almost positive that Missouri has executed at least two men who were completely innocent, and Leonard is one of them.
How is Leonard's daughter? I know one of the angles of it is that his daughter said that in 2004, when he was in California, I think she said that via an affidavit that he actually called Angela Rowe, the victim, and it's so sad that she was murdered and her three children. So his daughter maintained, hey, she was alive when he was in California with me. How is Leonard Taylor's daughter doing?
Obviously, she is pretty devastated by the whole thing. She actually flew in to St. Louis last Friday and tried to get a meeting with Wesley Bell, the prosecutor, who we were trying to get to activate a law that would have given him a court hearing to prove his innocence, and he refused to do it. And unfortunately, I don't think he didn't even give her the courtesy of meeting with her in person. He had one of his underlings do that. Leonard, knowing the situation, insisted that none of his family be there, and I think that was probably a wise move, because people have enough trauma in their lifetimes to not have this come up in their dreams. So it's not something that I would want to see if one of my relatives was in that position.
I want to talk about Prosecutor Wesley Bell for a minute. I've interviewed him before. He made history becoming the first black man to be elected a prosecutor in St. Louis County, Missouri. There's been a lot of talk about him on social media when it comes to this case. He said that there was no credible case of innocence. That's what Mr. Wesley Bell said. What were your thoughts on that with that comment from Mr. Bell?
Well, that's a ridiculous statement. How can you tell if something's credible if you don't hear it? That's why we have courts, to resolve credibility questions. But the key thing in the case, which you mentioned before, is it is a scientific impossibility that a body would have rigor mortis 8 to 10 days after the death. And Leonard had an airtight alibi for 8 days prior. And the coroner who changed his testimony, and originally he said 2 to 3 days they had been dead. But as soon as they found out Leonard had an airtight alibi, they started backtracking, and he testified at trial that it could have been anything from 1 to 3 weeks, which is ridiculous. And interestingly enough, he provided false testimony 30 years ago in a very celebrated case where he testified a young mother poisoned her baby, and then it turned out he died of a rare genetic disorder. And even when she was exonerated, he refused to admit he was wrong and wouldn't change the cause of death on the baby's birth certificate.
The medical examiner.
The same medical examiner. And we also found out that one of the cops who took Perry's statements, who he says beat him up and coached him, is now in prison in Missouri for a felony of secretly recording his neighbors in a state of undress. And the other officer has been.
Let me just say this really quick. I'm sorry, in case folks may not know. Perry was Leonard Taylor's brother,
right?
Who claims that he said Leonard Taylor committed this crime, but then said he was assaulted by police, that he was forced to say that his brother, they were stalking him, basically. That's according to what you see in the case. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I want to make sure folks know.
Yeah, that's correct. The only real direct evidence they had was Perry's statements to the police, where he said Leonard told him he did it, which is about as reliable as a jailhouse, what we call jailhouse snitch testimony. And they basically told him if he didn't implicate his brother, he was going to rot in jail. They'd already charged him with a felony. And as soon as he implicated his brother, they let him go. And then Perry started recanting immediately, and recanted in his pretrial deposition, recanted in front of the jury. But I think they manipulated the cause of the time of death. They manipulated some other evidence. It's a complicated situation, but they had no physical evidence, no motive. He had an airtight alibi. It's to say that's not a credible or at least colorable claim of innocence to which you ought to get a hearing in court is ridiculous.
Well, why do you think, and I know you can't read his mind, but Wesley Bell is considered to be a quote-unquote progressive prosecutor? Why do you think he...
I don't know. I mean, I was never able to speak to him directly about the case. I know that in some of my conversations with one of his lieutenants, it got pretty heated, and I actually asked her if Wesley had ever personally read the summary of his evidence of innocence that I provided to him, about an 18-page summary, and she sort of didn't have an answer to that question. And I said, well, tell him to read it, and then we can talk. But then if he doesn't think that he deserves a hearing, then I guess we just put too much faith in some of the things that he campaigned for. And he actually signed a letter a few years ago with other progressive prosecutors that said something to the effect that in death penalty cases, anytime there's a colorable claim of innocence, we believe that the person ought to be given a chance to prove it. And what he did in this case is totally the opposite.
Governor Mike Parson released a statement the day before because y'all were asking him to stop the execution. He called Mr. Taylor's claim of innocence self-serving. And then he brought up that Mr. Taylor was convicted of rape as well. In 2000. I just wanted to know your thoughts on that statement from Governor Parson.
Well, anytime somebody is innocent, and it would be self-serving to claim they're innocent. That's a twisted logic. And it doesn't matter what someone's criminal past is. If he isn't good for this murder, he shouldn't be executed. But there's also a lot of misstatements of the evidence. They never found Angela's blood on his glasses. That could have been any sort of genetic material, and it wasn't even conclusively that her DNA was on there with at least one other person. But it's not particularly incriminating. You wouldn't think it would be unusual if you're cohabitating in an intimate relationship with someone that your partner's DNA might be on your glasses or something like that. There's a lot of innocent ways that could have happened. But there was really nothing other than it's basically Perry's statement plus character assassination. The fact that he left town and had all these fake IDs and everything like that. That's because he was part of his way he made a living was selling drugs and doing fraud type crimes that he had explained in a lot of his interviews with the press. So it's an awfully thin case to kill somebody on, even
Kill somebody. That's what
very
I'm
thin.
saying. Mr. Gibson, did I read this right? I've been reading so many stories on this. Didn't a neighbor say that she saw Angela Rose kids playing after the November 24th? Is that accurate?
That's accurate. Actually, a neighbor, he had absolute reason to lie. Leonard left town on the day after, the Friday after Thanksgiving in 2004. But he's on video taking an early morning flight. That's 8 days before the bodies were found. So that's the day before Thanksgiving Day, or maybe the evening before Thanksgiving would have been the only window that he could have possibly done it, because the victims were seen alive before that. So in that narrow window would have been when they would have had to have been killed if Leonard did it. And Elmer Massey, the neighbor, saw Angela that weekend after Leonard was gone. The kids were playing with his kids. The sister of the victims saw her alive the Sunday of that weekend and sticks by her story. And particularly the neighbor, he would have no motive to lie about that. And he also said he saw some other guy going in and out of the house that week, because their bodies were found the Friday after Thanksgiving. The Friday after Thanksgiving, a week later. So Leonard had an airtight alibi for 8 days before the bodies were found.
Was that brought up at trial, or did the neighbors testify? Was that
Yeah,
brought up?
yeah. The neighbor testified, but I mean, the thing people need to understand, I think, and that's everybody involved in the criminal justice system. If this would have been a stealing case, he'd have been acquitted on this evidence in 5 minutes. But when you have a really heinous multiple murder and the jury's looking at photos of dead kids for 2 weeks straight, they resolve their doubts in favor of convicting someone in that situation. That's what happens. And they had all this other stuff that, Leonard was a criminal, and that's what I think happened. And they also the prosecutors also tried to get the sister and aunts who saw her alive to backtrack on their testimony, and they did. But then later, when they were interviewed more recently, they said that the two aunts of the kids and the sister of Angela all saw the victims or the kids alive or spoke to them on the phone after Leonard had already left town.
Now, one of the sisters, she's done an interview, and she said that she supported the execution and justice has been served. She did some local interviews in Missouri. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, we had interviewed her earlier than that, and she stuck by her story that she saw Angela the Sunday after Leonard had left town that Friday. But illogically, in my opinion, she says, well, he could have snuck back into town and done this, but that's not possible, because after Leonard was arrested, he was arrested in Kentucky about 10 days after or actually it wasn't even that long, about a week after the bodies were found. and they traced his whereabouts the whole period of time because he initially flew to Los Angeles and met his long lost daughter who he'd never laid eyes on before. And then he boarded a bus with some cocaine and he went to Atlanta, and then after that went to Kentucky, and the police were staking out he had a girlfriend in Kentucky, and as soon as he showed up there, they arrested him. So he could not have possibly committed this crime after he left town on the Friday. So
why do you think she supports the execution?
I don't know. It's a good question, because she told an investigator for our defense team that even though she sticks by her story that she was alive on the Sunday after Leonard left town, that there must have been a way that he secretly came back to St. Louis and committed the murders, which is not possible.
Mr. Taylor was also declined a spiritual advisor in the death chamber. That seemed, is that what Missouri does? Why was he declined a spiritual advisor?
That they said the reason that they did that is they had to give 7 days notice of who they wanted to be their advisor, so the prison could do the normal background checks that they do for every visitor, that including the press, which that was, I think, clearly pretextual, because he had gotten approval, which means he was background checked, to see Leonard the Saturday before the Tuesday night execution, the Sunday, the Monday, and the day earlier in the day. So that was a pretextual reason. And they didn't give us notice that they weren't going to let him in until the Monday night before about 24 hours before the execution occurred. And then we had filed a lawsuit. I was not involved in that aspect of the case, saying he was denied his religious rights, which is a Texas inmate got a stay of execution from the U.S. Supreme Court on this very same issue. And the government interference with religious liberty is an issue that the U.S. Supreme Court and the Trump majority are very keen on. And I think he would have had a very good chance to get a stay, but as I noted in a statement I released, they killed him before he could take that case up through the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals and into the Supreme Court. And we're asking that be investigated, because that's never happened before, where an inmate's been executed without being able to appeal his case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And it's that, just as I put in there, that adds insult to injury. And we've called for an investigation as to how this happened, because it's been practice for years, for nearly 100 executions, that they know that they're not to execute somebody until their appeals are exhausted. And the warrant was good for 24 hours, so they could have certainly waited and even into the next day. And if a stay wasn't granted, the execution could have proceeded then.
Were you there? Were you there at the execution?
I was not. I was working on I was working on his innocence issues. I have a co-counsel I'm in Kansas City. He's in St. Louis. The prison is about an hour away from St. Louis, but there are two other lawyers who were assisting on the case that also wanted to witness the execution if it happened, and they were denied access to, even though they had all gone through all the background checks and had visited him and other prisoners, and so it's just all seemed arbitrary to us. And I think there was a very good chance that at least the Supreme Court would have stayed his execution, but we'll never know now.
We'll never know. What was your last conversation with Mr. Taylor?
Well, I was the last attorney to talk to him, because I was informed by the clerk of the United States Supreme Court that the Attorney General and the prison officials had told him in light of the ongoing child religious liberty lawsuit, that the earliest the warrant said that was activated at 6 p.m. Central Time, and I was told that they weren't going to, the earliest they could possibly carry out the execution, depending on how long it took to take the case up through the Supreme Court, would be 7 o'clock. So I called Leonard and told him that. And then I was in my office. This was probably about 5 or 5:30. I informed my co-counsel I was going to run home for a little bit to see to my dog, and then I called back my co-counsel about 6:20, somewhere in there, and asked what was going on because I hadn't heard anything, and he said that they had killed him. They killed him at 6, and even though the district court had denied the stay about 10 minutes till 6, and they started the execution just after 6 while we were filing the notice of appeal to the 8th Circuit. And this has never happened before. Everybody knows, the Attorney General, the prison, that you're not supposed to do this. Anytime there's a appeal in federal court in a death case, it always goes all the way to the top. So that's why this has never happened in the nearly 100 executions that Missouri's conducted in the last 30-odd years.
How did he sound in your last conversation with him?
He was very upbeat. Thing, I've seen it before, and you can't imagine what's going through somebody's mind in that situation. It's just incomprehensible. But I guess everybody's different. Every person is different. But he was remarkably upbeat, and and the bad thing about it is it's common practice in these cases that, particularly in the Supreme Court, they will call the attorney about 10 or 15 minutes before they officially deny the stay, just to give the attorney a chance to tell the condemned man the bad news, so they know what's coming. But in this case, he thought, he was safe at least until 7, if not overnight, and then they came to get him and killed him before anybody could tell him that was going to happen or could happen. So that makes it even worse, I think.
It feels so. It feels so cruel what you're laying out. Not having the spiritual advisor, not allowing it to go to the Supreme Court according to what you said. It feels so like they were almost in a rush to kill him. Is that the? Do you get that sense too, or?
I think that's right. I mean, the warrant, they could have killed him as late as 24 hours later, and it doesn't happen so much anymore. But back in earlier days, when the courts were more receptive to inmate issues, and the law was not as bad as it is now, that at this stage of the process, it was not unusual for prisoners to get stays at the last 11th hour. And it was not uncommon for Missouri used to execute people at midnight for them to have to wait until 3, 4 in the morning, or for all the appeals to take their course. So it's just there's no reason that they had to do it, particularly when particularly the prison and attorney generals should know that even though the appeal hadn't been officially filed, that it was only like 10 minutes after the district court denied the stay that they started the execution process, and he was dead before the appeal got officially filed. And there's no reason for that. But I don't think it's much of a secret that a lot of the politics in Missouri, and particularly the powers that be, the governor is an ex-sheriff from rural Missouri, and he's got no problem with the death penalty. Our current attorney general is is has the same attitude. So and so it's I think they they certainly didn't have a problem with doing it, and um, they did it as soon as they could legally. Legally could. So it's a sad situation.
Last question before you go, and again, thank you for your time, Mr. Gibson. What's your final message or your final comment to Governor Parson and Prosecutor Wesley Bell?
I think that they need to educate themselves about how many innocent people are wrongly convicted, even sentenced to death. And I think any fair-minded person looking at the evidence in this case would conclude that he deserved an opportunity to prove his innocence in a court of law. And if we'd have been given that opportunity, I think we would have removed any doubt that he couldn't have possibly killed these people. It was a scientific impossibility. And you got other tainted evidence, a proven lying medical examiner, the cops who coerced Perry's confession. One of them is now in prison himself, and the other has been charged with numerous civil rights violations for beating Black Lives Matter type protesters. In fact, he's facing 17 lawsuits. If all this had come to light, I don't think there's any way that a new jury would have convicted him.
Hmm. Again, Leonard Taylor was executed February 7th. He was 58 years old. And I also want to just give my condolences to Angela Rowe. She was killed in 2004, and her three children.